War reduced life to a single, relentless question: how long could the body endure before it gave up? In the early years of the conflict, this question haunted mothers more than anyone else. Their days were shaped by ration lines, empty cupboards, and the constant arithmetic of hunger. Bread was counted in slices thin enough to feel symbolic rather than sustaining. Soup was stretched with water until it lost both color and strength. Children learned early to stop asking for more, not because they understood sacrifice, but because they sensed the quiet despair behind their mother's eyes. Every decision carried weight: whether to eat now or save for later, whether to venture out in search of aid or remain hidden to avoid attention. Survival was no longer a shared human concern. It had become a private burden carried in silence. The streets outside reflected the same erosion. Once familiar neighborhoods were scarred by bomb damage, their walls blackened, their windows patched with boards or paper. Shops stood half-empty or entirely closed, their signs faded and crooked. The soundscape of daily life had changed too. Where there had once been conversation and routine noise, there was now a tense quiet punctuated by distant explosions, sirens, or the heavy footsteps of authority. These sounds trained people to anticipate danger. For mothers, this anticipation never rested. Even moments of stillness felt temporary, as if calm itself were only gathering strength before breaking again. Years of occupation and conflict had taught harsh lessons. Knocks on the door rarely brought relief. They signaled inspections, confiscations, forced labor orders, or worse. Each knock carried the possibility of separation: children taken, husbands questioned, homes searched. Mothers learned to read the space between sounds, to judge whether footsteps outside were approaching or passing by. They learned to hide what little food they had, to keep children quiet, to school their faces into neutrality. Fear became a skill, sharpened by repetition. Hunger amplified everything. It stripped away the margins of patience and turned ordinary worry into constant dread. Mothers watched their children's faces change as cheeks hollowed and eyes grew too large for their frames. Clothes hung loose, patched and repatched until fabric itself seemed exhausted. Illness spread easily where bodies were weak, and medical care was scarce or inaccessible. A cough could become a death sentence. Fever was not just a symptom but a threat that lingered without treatment. Each morning, mothers took inventory not just of food, but of breath, counting the rise and fall of small chests, relieved when the count continued. In this environment, expectations hardened. Experience suggested that power only flowed in one direction, and it did not bend toward mercy. Aid, when it came at all, was conditional, transactional, or cruelly insufficient. It often arrived wrapped in ideology or control, demanding obedience in exchange for survival. Mothers learned to distrust promises and to assume that any intervention would carry a cost greater than its benefit. Hope itself became dangerous, because disappointment drained strength faster than hunger. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical one. Mothers carried not only their own fear but the emotional weight of those around them. Children looked to them for reassurance they could not honestly give. A calm voice became a form of protection, even when the heart behind it was racing. At night, sleep came in fragments, interrupted by worry and the anticipation of the next day's shortages. Dreams, when they appeared, often returned to memories of abundance, tables full, laughter loud, only to make waking reality feel even harsher. Rumors circulated constantly, filling the gaps left by unreliable information. Stories of deportations, camps, and reprisals moved through communities like a second war, invisible but devastating. Mothers listened carefully, separating what might be true from what was simply fear repeating itself. Still, every story reinforced the same conclusion: vulnerability invited cruelty. To be seen was to be exposed. To be noticed was to risk everything. When resources disappeared entirely, desperation forced impossible choices. Some mothers bartered family heirlooms for food, trading the past for the present in a single exchange. Others sent older children to work or beg, knowing the dangers but seeing no alternative. Each choice left a mark, shaping how they saw themselves and the world. Pride eroded under necessity, replaced by a narrow focus on endurance. Morality itself seemed to shift, no longer about ideals but about keeping children alive one more day. Against this backdrop, the idea of kindness from an occupying or foreign authority felt absurd. Experience had trained expectations toward harm, not care. The uniform, the official presence, the knock at the door, all were symbols of threat. Mothers rehearsed responses in their minds. What to say, what to hide, how to stand. They positioned themselves between their children and the outside world, prepared to absorb whatever came next. This posture became instinctive, a physical manifestation of fear shaped by years of betrayal. Yet even within this hardened state, something fragile persisted. It was not optimism, but a quieter refusal to completely surrender to despair. Mothers continued to clean, to tell stories, to create small routines that suggested a future beyond the next meal. These acts were not hopeful so much as defiant. They asserted that life, however diminished, was still worth structuring, still worth protecting. But this defiance existed alongside the certainty that any external intervention would likely shatter what little stability remained. So when footsteps finally stopped at the door, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Muscles tightened, breath caught. The room seemed to shrink as attention narrowed to that single point of entry. Children were pulled close, hands clasped too tightly, as if physical contact alone could prevent loss. In that moment, the expectation of cruelty was not exaggerated or dramatic. It was logical. It was the product of lived experience. The door represented history itself, pressing forward with all its previous violence and indifference. This was the emotional landscape at the threshold, starved, desperate, and braced for harm. The mothers did not expect salvation or understanding. They expected judgment, demand, or removal. They expected to lose something else they could not afford to give up. The fact that they still opened the door at all was not an act of trust, but of resignation. In war, refusal often carried consequences worse than compliance. What they did not yet know was that this moment would disrupt everything they had learned to expect. But before that disruption could unfold, the weight of the past had to be fully present. Chapter 1 of this story is defined by that weight, the accumulation of hunger, fear, and experience that made cruelty seem inevitable. Without understanding this depth of expectation, the reversal that followed would lose its meaning. The door was not just wood and hinges. It was the boundary between what history had taught them and what they were about to discover. The moment the door opened, the mothers were prepared for the familiar choreography of fear. Their bodies reacted before their minds could fully process what they were seeing. Shoulders stiffened, hands tightened around children's arms, eyes dropped instinctively to the floor or scanned for signs of danger. This reflex had been perfected over years of occupation and loss. Yet almost immediately, something felt wrong. Not wrong in the sense of threat, but wrong in the sense that the expected pattern failed to appear. The figure standing outside did not rush forward, did not bark orders, did not invade the space with entitlement. They stood still, measured, as if aware of the tension radiating from the room and unwilling to provoke it. The silence that followed was unsettling. War had taught people to fear silence almost as much as noise, but this pause carried a different quality. It was not the sharp stillness before violence, but a deliberate restraint. The men at the door wore uniforms, and uniforms alone were enough to summon memories of terror. Yet their posture lacked aggression. Their eyes did not roam hungrily over the interior, searching for contraband or weakness. Instead, they seemed to wait, allowing the moment to breathe. For mothers accustomed to being overwhelmed, this hesitation felt disorienting. Confusion crept in slowly. The women had rehearsed responses to threats, not to uncertainty. They expected commands, not patience. Every second that passed without intrusion challenged the assumptions carved into them by years of hardship. The children sensed it too. Some peeked out from behind skirts or sleeves, their expressions caught between fear and curiosity. They had learned to recognize danger quickly, and this hesitation did not fit any lesson they knew. The men identified themselves not through force, but through calm explanation. Their presence, they indicated, was not meant to punish or take. This alone felt implausible. Mothers listened with skepticism sharpened by survival. Words had deceived before. Promises had been tools of manipulation. Still, tone mattered, and the tone carried no threat. It was careful, almost subdued, as though the speakers understood they were intruding into a space shaped by trauma. What unsettled the mothers most was the absence of immediate demand. There was no list of requirements, no inventory to be seized, no ultimatum disguised as policy. Instead, there was acknowledgement of hunger, of exhaustion, of children too thin for their age. This recognition was not accusatory. It did not imply failure or blame. It simply named what was already visible, without judgment. For women accustomed to having their suffering ignored or exploited, being seen in this way felt dangerously unfamiliar. The British presence carried an unexpected orderliness, but not the kind enforced through fear. It was procedural rather than punitive. Movements were precise, but not rushed. Voices remained level. Even the way space was respected felt intentional. They did not step fully inside without permission. They did not touch children without consent. These small acts accumulated quickly, each one contradicting years of learned expectation. Mothers searched for the hidden cost. There had to be one. Aid, if this was aid, never came freely in war. It was tied to allegiance, labor, or silence. They watched closely for signs of manipulation, for the moment when kindness would pivot into control. Yet that moment did not arrive. Instead, there was explanation rather than instruction. There was structure rather than threat. This did not erase fear, but it complicated it. As supplies were mentioned, disbelief surfaced openly. Food had become an abstract concept for many families, something discussed more often than experienced. The idea that it could be offered without coercion felt almost cruel in itself, like teasing hope only to withdraw it later. Mothers had learned to guard against this emotional risk. They had survived by assuming disappointment. Now, they struggled to maintain that defense in the face of actions that did not match their expectations. The atmosphere in the room began to shift, not toward comfort, but toward fragile instability. Certainty, however grim, had been a form of safety. Knowing that authority meant harm allowed for preparation. Uncertainty stripped that preparation away. The women were forced into a psychological space they had avoided, cautious consideration. They had to decide in real time whether to believe what they were witnessing or to continue bracing for betrayal. Children reacted faster. Hunger makes instinct honest. When food was produced, even in small quantities, their attention locked onto it with a focus that bordered on reverence. Mothers intervened quickly, pulling them back, whispering restraint. They had learned that premature acceptance could be punished. But the expected reprimand never came. No one scolded the children for reaching. No one accused the mothers of poor control. Instead, there was patience, even encouragement, tempered with an awareness of scarcity. This was not generosity without limits. The care offered was structured, rationed, intentional. Yet even this limitation felt different. It was designed to sustain rather than dominate. The British approach did not promise abundance, but it did promise consistency. In a world where chaos had been constant, the idea of predictable support carried its own weight. Emotionally, the mothers existed in a state of suspended disbelief. Relief hovered at the edges, but fear kept it from settling. They had been wrong before, and wrongness had cost them dearly. Still, cracks began to form in the armor of expectation. Each respectful interaction widened those cracks. Each fulfilled statement undermined the belief that cruelty was inevitable. The men eventually left, and the door closed again. This time, the sound did not echo with the same finality. The room remained tense, but something else lingered, a question rather than a wound. Mothers stood still for a long time, replaying the encounter in their minds. They searched for details they might have missed, signs that danger had merely been postponed. But memory returned the same images. Calm voices, measured actions, restraint where none had been required. That night, sleep came differently. Fear remained, but it was no longer absolute. Thoughts circled around the encounter, testing its reality. Could this have been an exception? A strategic pause before harsher measures? Or was it evidence of something fundamentally different? The mothers did not allow themselves to answer. Hope was still too risky. But the certainty of cruelty had been interrupted, and that interruption mattered. Chapter 2 of this story exists entirely within that disruption. Nothing had yet been resolved. Hunger still pressed, war still raged, and danger had not disappeared. But a crack had formed in the narrative that had governed survival. For the first time in years, the mothers were forced to confront the possibility that power did not always arrive to take. That realization, fragile and unsettling, marked the beginning of a deeper transformation, one that would test not only their trust in others, but their understanding of what humanity could still mean in a world at war. Care did not announce itself loudly, and that quiet persistence was perhaps its most disarming quality. It arrived not as a single dramatic intervention, but as a series of repeated, almost mundane actions that slowly altered the rhythm of daily life. Food came in measured portions, not enough to overwhelm bodies long weakened by deprivation, but sufficient to restore strength without harm. The regularity of its arrival mattered as much as its substance. For families accustomed to randomness and loss, predictability itself felt radical. Each delivery challenged the deeply ingrained belief that survival depended on secrecy and luck rather than structure. The mothers watched everything closely. They had learned that danger often hid behind routine, that patterns could be used to lull people into compliance before tightening control. So they observed the process with a vigilance sharpened by experience. They noted how supplies were distributed, how records were kept, how children were weighed and monitored with clinical care rather than judgment. There was no spectacle, no attempt to display benevolence for approval. The work unfolded with a professional detachment that paradoxically felt more sincere than emotional displays ever could. Children were the first to show visible change. Hunger leaves marks that are difficult to erase, but even small improvements register quickly in young bodies. Color returned slowly to faces once gray with exhaustion. Movements grew less tentative. Where there had been listlessness, there was now cautious energy. These changes were subtle at first, noticeable only to mothers who had memorized every detail of their children's bodies. A slightly steadier step. A deeper breath during sleep. A request for play rather than food. Each sign carried immense emotional weight. For the mothers, these changes stirred conflicting emotions. Relief surfaced alongside guilt, as if accepting care meant acknowledging a failure to protect their children on their own. War had stripped them of control repeatedly, and dependence felt like another loss. Yet the evidence in front of them was undeniable. Their children were stabilizing, not deteriorating. Illness receded rather than spreading. Weakness no longer defined every waking hour. Care, delivered without cruelty, was accomplishing what endurance alone could not. What made this intervention distinct was its refusal to humiliate. In many wartime aid efforts, recipients were reminded constantly of their vulnerability, their debt. Here, there was no rhetoric of rescue. The mothers were not framed as helpless, nor were they praised for gratitude. They were treated as partners in a process aimed at survival. Instructions were given, but they were practical rather than moralizing. The focus remained on outcomes, not obedience. Time played a crucial role. One day of kindness can be dismissed as strategy or coincidence. 2 days raise suspicion. A week forces reconsideration. As days accumulated without reversal, the mothers found their defenses slowly exhausting themselves. Maintaining constant suspicion requires energy, and hunger had already depleted reserves. Gradually, vigilance softened into cautious acceptance. This was not trust, not yet, but it was something close enough to allow rest. Rest itself became transformative. For the first time in months or years, some mothers slept without waking in panic. The body, no longer pushed to the edge of survival every moment, allowed itself to recover incrementally. Mental clarity returned in fragments. Decisions no longer felt purely reactive. This shift exposed just how profoundly deprivation had shaped their perceptions. They began to realize that fear had narrowed their world, compressing thought into survival alone. The British care system operated with an emphasis on consistency. Schedules were kept. Promises once made were fulfilled. When shortages occurred, they were explained rather than concealed. This transparency mattered deeply to people who had been conditioned to expect deception. Even bad news felt different when it was delivered honestly. It preserved dignity, allowing mothers to plan rather than panic. Importantly, care did not erase boundaries. Authority remained visible, but it was exercised with restraint. Rules existed, but they were clear and applied evenly. This balance prevented chaos without reproducing oppression. The mothers noticed this distinction acutely. They had lived under systems where rules shifted unpredictably, weaponized to maintain dominance. Here, structure functioned as protection rather than threat. Emotionally, the shift was slow and uneven. Some mothers resisted longer than others, clinging to suspicion as a form of self-preservation. Trauma does not dissolve easily, and kindness can feel as dangerous as cruelty when it contradicts everything learned through pain. Still, even the most guarded could not ignore the accumulating evidence. Children were safer. Hunger was receding. The absence of punishment was becoming habitual. As care continued, a subtle moral inversion began to take shape. Power, once associated exclusively with harm, was now linked, at least in this limited context, to preservation. This did not rewrite history or erase suffering, but it complicated the narrative the mothers had relied on to survive. They were forced to confront a reality in which authority could choose not to exploit vulnerability. That possibility unsettled deeply held beliefs about the nature of wartime power. This inversion carried psychological consequences. It reopened questions the mothers had long buried. If cruelty was not inevitable, then what had happened before was not simply fate, but choice. This realization brought anger alongside relief. Anger at those who had chosen harm when alternatives existed. Anger at systems that normalized suffering. Care, in this sense, did not simply heal, it illuminated injustice more sharply. Children absorbed the change differently. They adapted quickly, their memories shorter, their instincts geared toward the present. For them, care became part of the environment rather than an anomaly. This worried some mothers, who feared attachment could make future loss more devastating. Yet they also recognized the cost of perpetual deprivation. Childhood had already been stolen in many ways. Allowing moments of stability felt like reclaiming something essential, even if temporarily. The environment itself began to change. Spaces once defined by scarcity grew more organized. Cleanliness returned where possible, not as an aesthetic choice but as a health measure. These improvements reinforced the sense that life could be structured around something other than survival alone. Order ceased to feel like surveillance and began to resemble care. Still, no one spoke openly of trust. It remained an unspoken negotiation, expressed through behavior rather than words. Mothers complied with guidelines not out of fear, but because outcomes validated cooperation. This distinction mattered. Compliance born of fear breeds resentment and resistance. Compliance grounded in observed benefit fosters participation. The difference reshaped daily interactions in quiet but profound ways. Chapter 3 of this story is defined by accumulation. Not a single act of kindness, but the sustained refusal to exploit vulnerability. Care changed everything not by dramatic rescue, but by endurance. It stayed. It repeated itself. It became boring in the best possible way. And in that boredom, something extraordinary happened. The mothers began to believe, not fully, not safely, but enough to breathe. Enough to let their children eat without flinching. Enough to imagine that survival might involve more than simply avoiding the next blow. Trust does not arrive as a single decision, especially for those shaped by prolonged fear. It enters slowly, often disguised as fatigue. After weeks of watching, measuring, and waiting for betrayal that never came, the mothers began to experience a different kind of exhaustion. Maintaining constant suspicion required energy they no longer had to spare. Hunger had trained them to conserve every resource, and now that physical survival felt less precarious, emotional defenses became the next thing to soften. This was not surrender. It was adaptation to a changing reality. The first signs of trust were almost invisible. A mother allowed her child to step forward without pulling them back immediately. Another stopped hiding small food portions, no longer convinced they would be seized. Some began to ask questions, not demands, but genuine inquiries, about schedules, about next deliveries, about health. These questions marked a shift from defensive silence to cautious engagement. Asking implied an expectation of continuity, and that expectation itself felt risky. What replaced fear was not confidence, but a fragile form of patience. The mothers learned to wait without panic, to believe that absence did not automatically signal abandonment. When a delivery was delayed, anxiety surged, but it no longer collapsed into despair. Explanation mattered. Being informed, rather than kept in the dark, restored a sense of agency that war had stripped away. Even bad news, when shared honestly, allowed dignity to survive. This process forced the women to confront how deeply violence had reshaped their instincts. They realized how reflexively they anticipated harm, how automatically they braced themselves against every interaction. This awareness was uncomfortable. It revealed scars they had been too busy surviving to examine. Trust, even in small increments, exposed the cost of prolonged trauma. It brought grief to the surface, grief not only for losses, but for the version of themselves that had existed before fear became constant. Relationships among the mothers themselves began to change as well. Scarcity had fostered isolation, turning neighbors into competitors. Now, with resources distributed more reliably, the atmosphere shifted. Information was shared more freely. Warnings gave way to coordination. Women compared observations, noting patterns of consistency and fairness. Collective experience replaced rumor. This communal processing strengthened confidence in what they were seeing. Trust became a shared conclusion rather than an individual gamble. The British personnel did not demand emotional openness, and this restraint proved crucial. They did not insist on gratitude or declarations of loyalty. By allowing trust to develop organically, they avoided replicating the coercive dynamics that had defined so many previous encounters with authority. The absence of emotional pressure made space for genuine change. Mothers could remain reserved without consequence, and that freedom paradoxically encouraged openness. As days settled into weeks, routines formed. Children attended health checks without resistance. Mothers followed nutritional guidance, even when it conflicted with habits shaped by starvation. These adjustments were not easy. Bodies weakened by long-term deprivation struggled to adapt. There were setbacks, illness, fear, moments of regression. But the system responded with patience rather than punishment. Mistakes were corrected, not condemned. This reinforced the sense that care was not conditional on perfection. Emotionally, the mothers existed in a state of cautious recalibration. They began to imagine short-term futures again, not years ahead, but days and weeks. Planning meals, planning rest, planning care for children who might soon have more energy than exhaustion. These small acts of foresight were radical after years of living hour to hour. They suggested a belief, however tentative, that life would continue. Yet trust brought vulnerability. Allowing oneself to believe in care meant reopening the possibility of loss. The mothers were acutely aware of this risk. They had lost too much already to embrace hope lightly. Nighttime remained difficult. Old fears returned in the dark, unchallenged by visible evidence. Dreams replayed past betrayals, reminding them how easily safety could vanish. Trust during daylight did not erase fear after sunset. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The mothers no longer saw themselves solely as targets or burdens. They were being treated as individuals whose decisions mattered. This recognition restored a sense of self that war had eroded. Dignity, once stripped away piece by piece, began to reassemble. Not dramatically, but through everyday interactions that affirmed competence rather than helplessness. Children responded to this shift in their mothers. They sensed the reduction in tension, the loosening of constant vigilance. Laughter, once rare and quickly suppressed, returned in brief bursts. Play re-emerged, tentative at first, then more confident. For the mothers, this was both joy and pain. Joy at seeing childhood reappear. Pain at realizing how thoroughly it had been suppressed. Trust in care allowed these moments to exist, even if they felt fragile. The broader moral implications became harder to ignore. The mothers were forced to reconcile their lived experience of cruelty with this sustained example of restraint. It did not excuse what had been done to them or others. Instead, it sharpened the contrast. They began to understand that suffering was not an unavoidable feature of war, but often the result of choices made by those in power. This realization deepened both gratitude and resentment, emotions that coexisted without canceling each other out. Trust, then, was not simple belief in benevolence. It was a complex, uneasy acknowledgement that care could exist alongside conflict, and that individuals could act differently within the same historical moment. The mothers learned to hold this contradiction without resolving it. They did not need to idealize those who helped them. It was enough to recognize consistent, humane behavior where they had expected none. Chapter 4 of this story is not about comfort, but about recalibration. It captures the slow, painful process of relearning how to live in a world that no longer aligns with worst expectations. Trust emerged not as a declaration, but as a pattern observed over time. It reshaped how the mothers moved through each day, how they related to authority, to each other, and to themselves. In choosing to believe their own experience over their fear, they crossed an invisible threshold, one that would make it impossible to return entirely to the assumptions that had once governed survival. As bodies slowly recovered, something less visible but equally profound began to surface. Strength returned not only to muscles and lungs, but to posture, expression, and presence. Mothers who had once moved through their days with shoulders curved inward now stood more upright, their movements less apologetic, less hurried. Hunger had reduced life to a narrow tunnel of endurance, but nourishment widened that tunnel just enough to allow reflection. With physical survival no longer consuming every thought, space emerged for something long suppressed: dignity. This dignity did not announce itself in grand gestures. It appeared in small decisions reclaimed. A mother chose how to divide food rather than simply how to stretch it. She corrected a child gently instead of letting exhaustion dictate silence. She washed clothes not merely to prevent illness, but to restore a sense of order. These acts, mundane in peacetime, carried immense symbolic weight after prolonged deprivation. They signaled a shift from pure survival toward agency. Children mirrored this change quickly. As energy returned, so did curiosity. They began to ask questions not rooted in fear or hunger, but in interest. They explored spaces that had once felt threatening. Play reemerged, hesitant at first, then increasingly confident. For mothers, this was one of the most difficult transitions. Watching children play meant acknowledging how deeply fear had previously constrained them. It was a reminder of what had been lost, but also evidence of what could still be reclaimed. The environment itself responded to this internal transformation. Spaces once defined by chaos and scarcity grew more structured. Sleeping areas were reorganized. Mealtimes followed predictable rhythms. Cleanliness, once a luxury sacrificed to exhaustion, became achievable again. These changes were not imposed from outside. They emerged organically as energy returned. Order ceased to feel like an instrument of control and began to feel like protection. British care continued in the background, steady and unembellished. Its consistency allowed families to rebuild routines without constant interruption. Importantly, it did not intrude into personal identity. Mothers were not told who to be or how to feel. They were supported materially and medically, then left room to reclaim their own sense of normalcy. This restraint reinforced the moral reversal already underway. Power was present, but it did not demand submission or gratitude as proof of worth. With stability came memory. The mothers found themselves thinking back, not just to recent suffering, but to life before the war. These memories surfaced uninvited, triggered by ordinary moments. A child laughing, the smell of cooked food, the quiet of an evening without fear. Memory was bittersweet. It reminded them of losses that could never be undone. But it also reconnected them to identities that war had tried to erase. They were not only victims or survivors. They had been and still were parents, neighbors, individuals with histories beyond hunger. This reconnection brought emotional complexity. Gratitude for care coexisted with anger toward those who had chosen cruelty. Relief did not cancel grief. Instead, emotions layered upon one another, creating a richer but heavier internal landscape. The mothers were no longer numb, and feeling again came with both comfort and pain. Yet even pain felt preferable to the hollow exhaustion of starvation. It meant they were alive enough to process what had happened. Social dynamics shifted as well. With immediate survival less threatened, relationships among families deepened. Shared meals fostered conversation rather than silent calculation. Mothers exchanged stories, not just warnings. Mutual support replaced guarded isolation. This communal recovery mattered deeply. War had fractured trust not only between civilians and authority, but among civilians themselves. Rebuilding that trust was essential to restoring a sense of humanity. Children benefited most visibly from this change. As mothers regained confidence, parenting shifted from crisis management to guidance. Discipline returned, not as harshness, but as structure. Education, informal at first, began to matter again. Songs were taught. Stories were told. These acts were quietly radical. They asserted that the future still deserved investment, even amid uncertainty. The moral reversal at the heart of this story became clearer with time. The mothers had expected power to strip them further, to reduce them to dependence without dignity. Instead, they experienced a form of authority that enabled recovery without erasure. This did not make the war just, nor did it erase suffering elsewhere. But it proved that alternatives existed. Compassion was not incompatible with control. Care did not weaken order, it strengthened it. This realization reshaped how the mothers interpreted their own endurance. Survival was no longer solely a testament to personal sacrifice. It was also a reminder that suffering had been exacerbated by choices made above them. This understanding sharpened moral clarity. The mothers became more certain that cruelty was not inevitable, that it was a decision. And knowing that made future injustice harder to accept silently. Yet recovery was uneven. Some children bore long-term effects of malnutrition. Some mothers struggled with lingering fear and grief. Stability did not erase trauma. It simply created conditions where healing could begin. There were setbacks, moments when old anxieties resurfaced. But these moments were now met with support rather than isolation. Care had established a baseline of safety from which setbacks did not spiral into catastrophe. As weeks turned into months, the transformation became undeniable. Families who had arrived starved and desperate now moved with cautious confidence. They did not assume permanence, but they no longer lived as if disaster were imminent at every second. This shift altered how they saw themselves within history. They were not merely passive subjects of war's violence. They were witnesses to a different way power could be exercised. The significance of this change extended beyond individual lives. It challenged the dominant narrative of wartime authority as uniformly brutal. The mother's experience became a quiet counterexample, one that complicated simplified stories of occupation and liberation. It did not deny atrocity, but it refused to let atrocity define every interaction. In doing so, it preserved a more nuanced memory of the period. Chapter 5 of this story is about reclamation. Not of land or politics, but of selfhood. Nourishment restored bodies, but care restored something more fragile, the belief that life could still be shaped, that dignity could survive even amid ruins. The mothers did not forget the door they had opened in fear. But now, when they looked back on it, they saw not only terror, but the moment when expectation began to lose its grip. In that loss, something stronger took its place, a quiet, hard-won sense of worth that no longer depended solely on endurance. Time altered how the mothers remembered everything that had happened, but it did not soften it into sentimentality. Memory did not become kinder, it became clearer. As distance grew between the moment of starvation and the period of care, the contrast sharpened rather than faded. What remained most vivid was not simply that help had arrived, but how profoundly unexpected it had been. The door, once a symbol of threat, took on a layered meaning. It represented fear justified by experience, and the rupture of that experience by something entirely different. That duality stayed with them long after circumstances changed again. Looking back, The mothers understood that the transformation they had lived through was not miraculous or total. It did not erase war, nor did it undo what had already been lost. Some children never fully recovered their health. Some families were later displaced again. Some lives still ended too soon. Yet the period of care left a permanent imprint on how these women interpreted power, responsibility, and humanity. It disrupted the fatalism that war tries to impose, the belief that brutality is natural and compassion naive. What endured most strongly was the memory of choice. The mothers came to see that what had changed their lives was not abundance, but decision. Someone had chosen restraint where cruelty was possible. Someone had chosen consistency where neglect would have been easier. Someone had chosen to see starving women and children not as burdens or symbols, but as lives worth sustaining. That awareness reshaped how the mothers understood the past and how they judged the world that had produced their suffering. This clarity carried weight. It brought a quiet anger alongside gratitude. Gratitude for those who had acted with care, and anger toward those who had not. The experience made it impossible to accept explanations that framed suffering as unavoidable. The mothers had lived proof that alternatives existed even within war. That knowledge sharpened moral judgment. It did not make forgiveness easier, but it made accountability feel necessary. As the war moved on and circumstances shifted again, the mothers carried this lesson into new forms of hardship. When authority appeared elsewhere, they no longer assumed cruelty automatically, nor did they assume kindness. They watched more closely, judging actions rather than symbols. The uniform lost some of its absolute power over their fear. They had seen that appearance alone did not determine intent. This did not make them careless, it made them discerning. Children who had experienced this period carried its influence differently. For some, it became a foundational memory of safety amid chaos. For others, it existed only as a faint sense that stability had once been possible. Either way, it shaped how they responded to future uncertainty. Having known care, even briefly, changed the scale by which hardship was measured. It provided a reference point beyond deprivation. The mothers also reflected on themselves with new understanding. They recognized how fear had reshaped their identities, narrowing them to functions of endurance.